So my presentation today is based on a paper that's a bit of a work in progress. I had been invited to speak at the We Robots conference that was going to happen this April, which unfortunately, because of the COVID situation, had to get canceled. So a lot of these ideas are still very exploratory. I'm working through them, so I'm looking forward to the Q&A section and hearing your comments and questions about what I'll be speaking about. So generally what I'm looking at is, where do we draw the boundary between when people can use aspects of our identity, like our images or our voices or other representations of us without our consent? And when, if ever, should the law step in? And I think this is a particularly relevant conversation right now, because we're seeing these incredible advances in artificial intelligence and robotics, where you can actually create videos of people doing things they've never done, audio saying things they've never said, and robotics representations of them that are becoming more and more realistic. And I think before we get into the more negative sides of some of the ways these things are being used, I really want to emphasize that these technologies are being used for really positive and exciting things. We're seeing them being used in film for people who have had challenges with their voices. They're being able to have their voices recreated, and the robotics work that's being done is really innovative. But at the same time, we're seeing the non-consensual use of a lot of people's identities in ways that are a bit more problematic, and that's what we're going to be exploring today in the conversation. So I first became interested. Oh. Someone's muted. And I'm also the first practice run, so I'm sure there will be a few technical glitches. We'll probably hear someone doing the dishes at some point, or people will be beeping as they're coming in. So we'll work with it. But I became interested in the concept of identity manipulation in the work that I'm doing with the Equality Project. And the Equality Project is this incredible 7-year SSHRC-funded project run by Jane Bailey and Valerie Steeves, that looks at young people's experiences online, both their legal and social experiences. And one of the things that I've been working on is creating a criminal database where we're looking at all of the case law that has to do with tech-facilitated violence, and we've got a great team working on that. And we summarized about 800 criminal law cases, and as we were reading through these cases, we were finding this trend of people using different digital technologies to manipulate people's identities in order to cause them harm or to gain some benefit from it. And we saw this in a variety of different relationships. And so some of them weren't relationships where we expected this type of thing to happen. So there was a really interesting and tragic case out of BC with a man named Patrick Fox, who had created a website in his ex-wife's name. It was her first and last name, and he put out content that he had made up that was fake content, private content, and personal content that was decontextualized, and he put it on the internet in order for him to purposely destroy her life. And he was very public about this. He said he wanted to work within the law in order to drive her to homelessness or suicide. And he recognized the power of manipulating her identity presence online as a way to cause her harm in a way that he thought was legal, but actually turned out to be criminal harassment. And we saw other interesting cases. There was a case of a woman who was fairly recluse in Manitoba, and she was impersonating very famous people. She impersonated Eminem, the musician, rapper, and also a famous basketball player. And she created these personas and interacted with people and developed relationships and used these relationships to get things like nude photos from other people or to get money. And everyone who was impacted in all of these cases we read, all impacted by this digital identity manipulation. And so I started thinking about what the value is around our digital identities. And in doing that research, I started coming across deepfakes and all of this other content where we're seeing AI and robotics also being used on top of fake profiles and the like. And just for a quick plug of a study that I'm doing with the Equality Project and another PhD candidate, Chandel Goss, who's with the media studies department at Western. We're looking for people who've experienced online impersonation or identity manipulation. So if yourself or someone you know is interested in participating in interviews, we're looking for participants still, and I'll make sure to tweet out that information in case anyone wants more information about that study. So the general concept I'm looking at is identity, and identity is a tricky subject. When you look at the research around identity in sociology and psychology, there's dozens of complex theories about what our identities mean to us, what their values are in society, how we internalize them, how we create them. So it's a really slippery term. So for the context of this conversation, what I'm really looking at when I'm talking about identity is the way that people can understand us through either our audio presentation of things we're saying or things they're hearing us say, how they see us in visuals, photos, or interactions with an embodiment version of ourselves, and then the things they can read and write about us. So I'm limiting my ideas around identity to those aspects. And I think there's something very interesting happening with identity now that we have online identities. The concept of self-branding and creating personas that have some sort of value was something that was really limited to celebrities and politicians and public figures prior to the internet. But now that we have the internet, many of us are working on creating these digital identities, some of us more consciously than others, but regardless, if you have a Twitter profile or a Facebook profile or an Instagram profile, you're working on creating this identity. We're also seeing companies creating identity profiles about you for behavioral marketing, and some countries are developing digital identity tools to identify their citizens and people accessing their services. And so more and more, this concept of digital identity is getting social currency, it's getting financial currency, it's got an extra value to it. And because the internet creates sometimes a permanent digital footprint, we have to be very conscious of what content is put out there. And people who are looking to manipulate our identities are able to do so by creating fake content about us. And then when you Google our names, it comes up and it has a real impact on the ways that we're understood. And right now, during COVID, a lot of us are being put online in ways that maybe we might not have chosen to be online. Even this presentation, I think, had we not been in this global pandemic situation, I might have been in a classroom, with 30 people all in person, and maybe it wouldn't be recorded. But now this content is created about me, and these images and my vocal intonations can be used in AI products to create replications of me. So I think there's new concerns that we need to be thinking about around identity, particularly socially and in the law. So whenever we look at a social problem and try and find a legal solution to it, there's often a variety of legal options available to us. And so for this type of identity protections, you can look at criminal identity fraud. With deepfakes, some people have been successful using copyrights. There's potential for defamation to be used. There's a privacy tort of false light that I think could be really relevant to this type of issue. But the one area that I've become more and more interested in, and that I'll be speaking about today, is this concept of personality rights. So personality rights are general rights that have to do with your image, your voice, your ability to work on your own personality. And it's recognized differently in different jurisdictions. And so the research that I found in Canada and the United States was the way that this personality right is often presented is through this appropriation of personality or right of publicity. And what that generally is it's a protection that you have, that if someone uses your image or your voice or your likeness in a commercial context, such as to endorse a product or in a commercial, then you have a right to ask them to take the content down and be compensated for the damages that you'd experience. And so it's often used by celebrities or famous figures who have built up this financial value in their personality, in their persona. Though it's not limited to that. In Canada, the first case that we saw was a case called Krauss versus Chrysler, which involved a famous football star who had been featured in a Chrysler product. He wasn't successful in the end because he was really only in the background of the photo, and there was other issues. But that's when the tort was recognized. And so mostly it has been celebrities, but in Ontario, we recently had a case involving a woman who was just out jogging. She was out jogging on a beautiful day, probably like today, and a production company was filming people in this neighborhood she was in, and they took that image of her and they used it in a commercial they were creating for a condo development. And she ended up suing them for appropriating her personality. And when you read the case, you can see in the case this is an issue where she feels terrible about herself. She doesn't like the image. She had just given birth. She felt badly about her body, and she didn't want this image used. But she couldn't frame it in a way that it was like her wanting to control the right to her image. She had to frame it in a commercial context. And so when she was awarded damages, she was awarded $100 for the cost that it would have cost to hire an actor to jog across. And she was able to get the content taken down. So in Canada and the US, it's very much commercially focused. But as I was doing more research into personality rights, I started looking into some civil jurisdictions to see what they're doing there. And of course, our legal systems are very, very different. They're a bit apples and oranges. But I think some of the key issues that exist in the civil law might be able to be adopted in the common law. And one of the two jurisdictions that I looked at were Quebec and Germany. And in both of those jurisdictions, they have a larger personality right and a right to image. And I think whoever joined the call doesn't have their mute on. I can hear happy birds and outdoor noises. So you might want to just mute yourself. Thanks. Yes, so they have a broader right to personality and a right to image. And so this includes being able to control the use of your image in non-commercial contexts. And it's looking at a person's autonomy. It's looking at their ability to control the way that they're developing their personality. And I was really drawn to this because it looks at these non-economic protections. And the reason that I think looking at these non-economic protections right now is so important is because we're seeing an increased use of non-commercial images. We're in a very image-based society. We're sharing images amongst each other. It's a major part of our culture, and especially with this new technology around deepfakes and synthetic media and other type of technologies, you're able to replicate people and produce that information publicly without it being in a commercial context. And so there's impacts on that person's identity that isn't really covered very well under Canadian or American laws that address personality rights. Oh, there we go. Of course, whenever we're thinking about laws that limit people's ability to produce content and to share ideas, we need to think about balancing interests. So with each of these laws in all four jurisdictions, there has been balancing around freedom of expression and people's rights to public interest in things that are relevant to them. And so in Canada and the United States, where it's only protecting commercial rights, what they've seen is that even if you are earning a profit off of a particular thing that represents a person, it isn't always covered by the law. So, for example, things like biographies, plays, satirical skits, and documentary films aren't included. There was recently a really, it's a delight to read. You should absolutely read it if you have a chance. It involved Tommy Wiseau and a film called The Room. And this was a documentary film that was made about this film of his that he's created that's become a cult classic because it's a terrible film. It's kind of known as being one of the worst films in the world, and people go to theaters and it's a bit like the Rocky Horror where you throw spoons at the screen and you yell and cheer at different times. It's a lot of fun. They show it at the Mayfair if the Mayfair ever opens up again. and recommend that you go. But when this documentary film was made, Tommy Wiseau sued the filmmakers for copyright and a variety of other things, but also under personality rights, saying you can't use my image in this way, in this critical way. And he was unsuccessful in that because the courts have balanced the rights of filmmakers to make documentaries. In Quebec and Germany, where they have broader rights, economic and non-economic, there's also a balancing of interest there. Often if someone is a public figure or is someone of public interest, they won't be able to use appropriation of personality in all contexts. And I think this is really important because we don't want laws that limit our use of images and voices in all circumstances. I think that having full control over your image and voice in all circumstances is unrealistic and incredibly problematic, particularly when we're thinking about politicians who might want to hide particular information about them and only show the positive information about them. We want to protect those freedom of expression and public interest issues that are so near and dear to our society. Well, yeah, so I'd like to speak a bit about the technology that exists out there. Often the cases that I was reading about that had to do with appropriation of personality or various personality rights often involved. Oh, hi, whoever joined, do you want my muting yourself? Thanks. So most of the cases that we looked at involved actual people's images and actual people's voices being used, but there were examples of newly created content of them. So there were a few cases, one in Germany and a few in the States, that involved avatars that were used in video games or voice recordings of voice impersonators. So we have seen manipulated, created content used in the context of personality rights and appropriation of personality. But deepfakes are so novel. Deepfake technology is a technology that maps the biometric data of your face and then uses that information to put your face on top of an existing video. So it can make it look as though you've said or done things that you hadn't done. And of course, this technology has existed for movie makers for decades. We've seen this kind of technology used before, but in 2017, a Reddit user created this open source version of this face swapping technology, and since then it's really taken off with programmers who've been creating all sorts of deepfake videos. I think there's at least about 15 or 20,000 of them out on the internet, and so people have been really able to create this content using people's images, and most often without their consent, and most often not in a commercial context. Most of them are doing it for fun or for amusement. And also in some cases to harass people and or for social commentary. The term deepfake I find is a bit overused. Often when we're thinking about any form of manipulated media, we're calling it deepfakes these days, which deepfake is a more specific term. If you look at the research done by Witness, which is this great organization that looks at misinformation, they've created a bit of terminology around what's known as synthetic media that's really helpful, that differentiates between the type of media. So deepfakes is when you swap someone's face into an existing video. So you have a base video and you use a collection of images to put a new face onto an existing video. But there's also technology like facial reenactment, where like in a circumstance like this where I'm speaking live, you could swap out my face as well. And then voice synthesis, which we'll speak a bit later, is when AI has learned how to mimic someone's voice tics. And you can type in messages and it will say things in their voice. Bobby Chesney and Danielle Citron wrote a few great papers on deepfakes. So if you're interested in looking at some of the potential harms, we've seen it used for gender-based violence. We've seen it used for identity attacks. We've seen it used for some political interference, but much less than you would assume. Like any politicians who've been used in deepfake so far are often more social commentary than they are trying to trick people. And of course, there's cases of fraud. Another thing I think is important to think about is who is being targeted by identity manipulation when we're thinking about artificial intelligence. And what we've seen with deepfakes is that deepfakes are predominantly used to target women and to make sexual content about them without their consent. So Deep Trace Labs did a report where they had looked at about over 15,000 deepfake videos that existed online, and they found that 96% of all of the videos that existed online of deepfakes were sexual deepfakes that were made of women and were made without the consent of the women. Both the woman who's in the original pornography film and the woman whose face is being replaced. Neither person was generally consented in the creation of this video. And when you look at the stats, it's actually quite interesting too, because there's national and racial divides that come up in these stats. Where if you look at the non-consensual the non-sexual deepfakes, which are only about 4% of deepfakes, there's a bit of a better gender balance. It's mostly men, mostly celebrities, mostly from the United States. But if you look at the female ones, it's a balance of celebrities from various countries, the USA, the UK, and then this massive number of women from South Korea who have been targeted, and likely, I imagine, they're K-pop stars. And so we have to think about things like race and gender and how this plays into these technologies. And we've seen other examples of AI that's very gendered. The Deep Nude app was an app that you could use to put in photos of women who were fully clothed, and it would produce realistic-looking images of what they would likely look like naked. But if you tried to put in a photo of a clothed male, you wouldn't get results. The program didn't work for men. And we've also seen facial recognition technology used to dox sex workers, and often when it's used to dox sex workers, it's only targeting women sex workers and not male. So there is a gendered component that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about regulating or not this type of content. The next piece that I find really interesting is voice synthesis. And so voice synthesis has actually been quite convincing. There's already been a case where a CEO got a call from his head company, thought he was talking to his boss, and transferred $200,000 to an account because this voice synthesis technology is so convincing. And so if you have a lot of audio content on the internet, there's publicly available software that you can use to mimic people's voices. Recently, we saw Jay-Z's voice get mimicked, and so an AI was able to produce content of him rapping Shakespeare and rapping different bands, music, and it was mostly harmless stuff, but you could see that Jay-Z wanted to have control over his voice. This is something he's invested a lifetime in developing, his musical skills, and then to have it co-opted like this was really problematic, and he tried to get it taken down through copyright, but of course you can't copyright your voice, so he wasn't successful in getting that done. But I think it brings up this idea of, if this is done in a non-commercial context, they're not selling his music, they're only putting his music out there, can he have control over it? Whereas if this was in a commercial, there was a case where in the States where Tom Waits, his voice was impersonated for a potato chip commercial, but because it was done in a commercial context, he was able to use his right to publicity and appropriation of personality rights in order to get compensated for that and to get the content taken down. And in that case, he was actually awarded damages for the embarrassment that he experienced because he didn't want his music associated with his potato chip brand. So the States has recognized some dignity-based rights in this personality right, but you have to have the initial commercial aspect to it in order to get the case to move forward. The Jordan Peterson case I found really interesting. So he is obviously a very controversial figure. He has a lot of content online to get his audio content. And so what someone had done is they made a website called notjordanpeterson.com. And anyone in the world could go onto that website, they could type whatever they wanted into the website, and it would come out with an audio recording that sounded just like Jordan Peterson. And so fans of his were going onto the site and they were recording messages of Jordan Peterson saying like, "You're great, I love you," and they were getting like pumped up by hearing these messages of their hero saying these positive things to them. But then people who weren't fans of Jordan Peterson were going on and they were making him say things that he would never say. They had him reading the feminist scum manifesto, which is a really controversial manifesto written in the 70s by Valerie Solanas, I believe her name is. And when this content started coming out, Jordan Peterson made a blog post where he was outraged about what had happened. And he wanted this taken down. He called for wide criminalization of deepfakes. I'm just trying to find the quotes that he has. So he says, and it seems to be that we should perhaps throw caution to the wind and make this an exceptionally wide-ranging law. We need to seriously consider the idea that someone's voice is an integral part of their identity and the reality of their person, and that stealing that voice is a genuinely criminal act, regardless perhaps of intent. And so he was calling for a full criminalization, regardless of whether this was satirical or not, if there was no consent. So he was quite upset about his voice being used in this way, and legitimately so. But the thing that I find interesting was that this wasn't the first time that his voice had been impersonated. Previously, another company called Coding Elite had replicated his voice, but what they had used it for was to have him rap some of Eminem's music. And so he's a fan of Eminem. He thought it was really amusing and cute and fun, so he didn't have any problem with his voice being replicated. But it was only when it started going against his identity, his desired identity presentation as this kind of masculine leader of the kind of lost boys of the internet. And that's when it really triggered him, and he thought, like, this has gone too far, and I think these are things to think about, especially when it comes to public figures who, we might not want to have as strong of protections against the use of their voices and images. We're also seeing replica robots, which are really interesting. There's something about the embodiment of a person that really gets into that like ick factor of how we feel about things being recreated about us. And most of the content that we're seeing with robot replications are people who want them done. So the two photos that you can see, the man with the crossed legs and then the woman with the hat on, both of these people consented to having robots made for them. Hiroshi Ishiguro is actually a very famous roboticist himself, and he made this Geminoid copy of himself that could represent him in other places, and it mimicked his personality and body movements. The top robot, it's actually just her shoulders upwards, and it's Bina Rothblatt, and her wife Martine had this robot made, and in that robot, it's actually got AI in it that's been fed aspects of Bina's personality. So when you're talking to her, it's as though you're talking to Bina. And Martine said, this allows our identity to begin to transcend our bodies after death, which is a really interesting idea as long as you have consent for it. But if we don't have consent of this, like now that we have this technology, do we want to be thinking about whether people can recreate us after our death? And we've seen AI technology where you can mimic people's texting. You can upload someone's texting into a program and it'll be as though they're texting you. And so there are examples of this happening already. Generally, if you're not a roboticist, it's a little tricky to get your hands on a robot. Two of the ways that you can do it is you can order one, or you can buy it or build it yourself. So ordering a replica robot is really tricky. Generally, the only companies that I've read of that are really doing it are companies that are producing sex dolls or sex robots, and they're very strict about which type of people they will recreate. They generally need consent from the person who's being recreated, and it sounds like it's quite rare for them to do it. But for example, in Abyss Creations, they've licensed Stormy Daniels' appearance, and now they sell replicas of Stormy Daniels that you can purchase and take home. But the one that's really interesting is the Scarlett Johansson robot here, who's in the bottom of the screen. So Scarlett Johansson wasn't made commercially. She didn't give consent to have her robot made. It was made by this hobbyist, Ricky Ma, who created this life-size, anatomically correct version of Scarlett Johansson, who she's programmed to be very charming, and she loves her creator, so she's expressing these things that that she loves Ricky Ma, and it's a bit odd to see, but because it's not made in a commercial context, there's not really a lot that someone like Scarlett Johansson could do to control the use of her image in this way. If it's just done by a hobbyist, these appropriation and personality laws wouldn't necessarily apply in Canada. The last example I'll talk about is Kanye West's movie Famous. And so in this case here, he did create replicas of people. He paid a company called Donda to create breathing, anatomically correct representations of a dozen people. And if you look at who's represented in these bodies that breathe and move, they were used in his music video and also in an art presentation. It's people like Bill Cosby and Donald Trump, who were both very well known for being accused of sexual violence. It's got Ray J and Kim Kardashian, who were famous for having their sex tape leaked. It's got Rihanna and Chris Brown, who we know that was a relationship of domestic violence. And then he's got Taylor Swift, who he's constantly fighting with in the media, lying right next to him. And when you look at this image, it's clearly a very sexual image, but what Kanye said was he didn't intend this image to be sexual or to negatively represent anyone in the images. It was just meant to comment on fame. But the thing that I think is really interesting and speaks to what we're talking about today is right after he released the film, he sends out this tweet that says, "Can somebody sue me already? I'll wait." And I think part of his artistic project was to see how the law would respond to this, or whether any of these people would come at him with some sort of legal argument around how they should be able to protect their identity. And it draws this interesting line between creative expression and art and people's rights to their identity that I think we need to think about, especially when you can embody them in this way. But again, I think these are questions that I don't necessarily have the answer to just yet, and am still exploring. But essentially, you know, what I've come to a conclusion for is that like our identities and our voices and our images have more than this commercial value. And I think when we're considering shaping laws around our identities, we need to think about dignity. We need to think about autonomy. And yeah, and that's the main thoughts that I've got. So I'd love to get questions from everyone about what you think about these new technologies, how they're being regulated. Oh, and my screen is frozen. Florian, can you send me a
Yes.
text if you're, can you still hear me?
We can hear you and we can see your slides.
Okay, I want my slide to move one over to where it says thank you for being such a great audience.
It's on it. I took control.
Okay.
So thank you so much, Suzie, for your presentation. It's super interesting. As you know, I have a huge interest in that field. And also, you know, as we all move online, doing like videos, teaching online, that raise like question, and some colleagues were like texting me about this. So I'm gonna like moderate the session. There is already the Q&A session. There is already some in the chat. So I will invite everybody who has a question to ask them in the chat, and I will read them for Suzie. So the first question, so the first comment mentioned that, so earlier in your presentation, you mentioned the need to strike a balance when considering personal rights. Can you speak about how jurisdictions that have expanded such rights have approached that balance? And are we seeing a factored analysis like in copyright, you know, with fair dealing, for example, for purpose of education, parody, etc.?
Yeah, I actually have been thinking a lot about copyright in this. I don't know a ton about copyright, but I think that there's something about this idea in copyright where you have the commercial right and you have the moral right. That's very similar to what we are thinking about when I'm thinking about identity rights. And I do think that we need to have a variety of factors that we take into consideration. You know, I think one of the first things we need to be thinking about is consent. Like, did you get consent? And that I almost think should be the first step. And I don't think you need consent in every option. Like, I think there are times, obviously, for news, for art, for satire, for criticism, you know, we're going to need exceptions for it. And so these are the types of things that I think we need to think about. We obviously need exceptions for certain public figures, but how far does that go? There was a case in Germany where it was like Princess Caroline Hanover, I believe her name is. I might be getting that wrong. But she was a public figure, and people were publishing images of her in gossip rags. And she said, this isn't fair. Like, just because I'm a public figure, I shouldn't have to worry about people taking photos of me while I'm eating dinner. And in Germany, they actually said no, that she wasn't protected. And she ended up having to go to a higher court in Europe that said just because you're a public figure doesn't mean that your private images can be used in whatever context. So I think even when we're thinking about public figures, we need to be thinking about what content is being used about them. And then, and of course, we all know that who is a public figure is a very confusing question these days when we think of Instagram influencers and you know, online bloggers who have a lot of followers. Yeah.
And I think like your last comment is very important, because so those rights in civil law, and as you know, so I'm civilist by training, were developed in, you know, another era where, like, you know, personality rights were not the same, or like being someone influential, like being someone famous, was not following the kind of same like frameworks. And yeah, and as you mentioned, like a lot of the civil law cases that build that right are relating to royalty.
Yeah, and when you look at that, and that's often with the law, no matter what, even with family law cases, it's often wealthy family members who are breaking up, you know. But what we, and even the examples that I gave, they were all celebrities, like they were all wealthy people. Well, I think this is an issue
because they have the power, you know, because they have the power to sue people, to go before the courts, to have the lawyers and stuff. And so another question that we have in the chat, and this is something I was also wondering during your presentation. So one of the attendees is asking, do you think that the criminal code should be updated in light of these issues? And maybe to kind of expand the question, so since the new provision about like revenge porn, or like the sharing of intimate image, do you think that we need to update those provisions to be able to tackle those new issues?
I think the criminal law is tough, right? Because I think criminal law is very symbolic. Like, when you have a law that says the state does not agree with this is a crime, I think that's important symbolically to say that this is wrong. And we have seen jurisdictions that have included deepfakes into their non-consensual distribution laws. But the trouble with criminal law is I don't think it's really getting to the solution that people want. You know, we've shown, especially with sexualized crimes, like criminal law hasn't been the greatest place for women in particular to go to find solutions. Really, the solutions that we want is we want the wrong recognized and the content taken down. So there's interesting models in Australia where they have the commissioner's office, where people can go to a government body, say this content has been made about me, I would like to get it taken down, and there's like an administrative body that then supports them in communicating with Facebook or Pornhub or whoever it is in getting the content taken down. And I think I'd rather see that type of a model in Canada, but often what people want is they want to say something has to be illegal before we have to take it down. So in some ways, you're almost forced to either criminalize it or turn it into a tort in order for the wrong to be recognized. So there might be some benefit, including deepfakes in the non-consensual distribution criminal laws.
Okay, thank you. Another question that we have in the chat. So in your Tom Waits discussion, you noted that it was the commercial appropriation that allowed him to get recourse. Too often, privacy, and especially in the US, claims seems to hit the same threshold barrier. Some concrete damages are required rather than recognizing the inherent dignity right underlying it all. So that person would like to have your thoughts on that comment.
Well, and I know in the States, their freedom of expression laws are so different than what we have in Canada. So it's difficult, and they're reluctant to have from what I know, again, I'm not an expert in American law, but from what I've read, they're much more reluctant to recognize dignity-based losses. So for Tom Waits example, it's very easy to calculate, how much would it had to pay him to do that commercial. That's something you can look to. How much do other musicians get paid to be in these types of commercials? It's very easy to quantify. And our legal system loves things that are easy to quantify. But often when it comes to these more, autonomy, dignity-based things that are focused around terms like identity value, like these are very elusive things to quantify. So I think the law is always going to struggle with it. Even looking at the privacy laws, when you look at Jones versus Siggy, which intrusion upon seclusion, I think the limitation was $20,000. But then for the privacy laws on publication of private facts, we've seen awards of upwards of $100,000. But what is it about the dignity factors that are different in there, and how did they come up with those numbers? It is unclear, and I think it's something that our legal system needs to work on, and I think also looking beyond just financial rewards. I think people want, particularly with sexual content, they want control over their sexual autonomy more than they want money.
Yeah.
And
so the next comment, and is the first COVID-19 related one. So one of the attendee mentioned those cases that we saw online or through the COVID-19 crisis. People have been taking photos and videos of people in public and posting them on social media to shame them or to highlight issues related to social distancing, physical distancing. And so that person was wondering if you could speak about how you think an expanded concept of personality rights might limit or interact with this kind of behaviors.
Yeah, so there, I think that there are some issues there. Again, it depends on whether there is a public interest issue. When you think about the case that happened yesterday or the day before with Amy Cooper, who did something in public that was horrifically racist. She was that woman who had the birder who asked her to put her dog on leash, and she called the police saying that a black man was threatening her life. In those circumstances, that might be an appropriate space for there to be a public conversation around that. I don't know if doxing her was appropriate, but I think that might be something that people would consider of public interest. But if you were, say, just sitting in your driveway having a conversation with a friend, following the distancing rules, and your neighbor is taking photos of you and publishing them online, should we be able to have some control over that? I think it's a really interesting question for where we would draw the boundaries between yes and no. But I do think that we have a societal problem right now around online shaming that's inappropriate. I don't know if the law is the way to answer that. I think that might be more of a cultural issue than a legal issue. But I do think that we should have more control over our images than we do right now.
Okay. Just before I move to the next comment, just one. So, si jamais vous avez des questions que vous voudriez poser en français, n'hésitez pas à les poser en français dans le chat. Et ça me fera plaisir de les traduire ou de les poser en français à Suzie si elle veut travailler sur son bilinguisme. So the next comment that we have in the chat relates, and so going back to the EU, that attendee is asking, what do you think about the right to be forgotten, or the right to erasure in privacy laws as the way to protect personal rights in deepfakes and AI uses in lieu of copyright protections? And yeah, and you highlighted this in your talk, and especially in the US, because of the way criminal law is built within the federal and the states, that's a lot of people the only way for them to take down, for example, revenge porn, especially when or the use of unauthorized use of intimate image, was just to use the DMCA to issue a copyright, which is an amazing creative way to use the DMCA, maybe the only very good way to use the DMCA. But yeah, so maybe if you could give us your thoughts about RTBF.
Yeah, and I think this really speaks to our values of our legal system. You know, there's so much protection for intellectual property rights. You know, I just wish that the law respected like our sexual autonomy in the same way that it respected intellectual property rights. I think we could all have much richer sexual lives if we had that kind of legal protection behind us. But copyright, I do think people have been using it because it is an effective way to get content taken down. And again, I think this circles back to the question of what is it that people actually want? You know, and often in these situations, what they want is the content removed, particularly with sexual deepfakes. So copyright has been a very useful tool for people to use. But I think the problem with relying on these types of laws, I absolutely recommend using them. If that is the legal solution that's effective and available, do it. But by relying on these laws, it gives a bit of a break from our lawmakers to think like, why don't we have this solution for deepfakes or for non-consensual distribution of intimate images? So we might need to be thinking about things like the right to be forgotten. Some of the trouble with the right to be forgotten, particularly when it comes to sexual images, is that they're often recreated, and reshared. It's almost impossible to get them fully taken off the internet. But I think with the right to be forgotten, often you're just de-indexing. And people who are looking to harm people through doxing and through misrepresenting their identity, they will spend the time and effort digging on the internet to find that content. And so I think for particularly harmful content, when we're leaning towards that content that we're sure we know is negative content, and with deepfakes, we saw swift reactions from Reddit, from Pornhub, from Google, from all of these companies that right away recognized this was a social wrong, that we don't agree with. Non-consensual deepfakes are a problem, and we need to take them down. But I do think in those cases we need more content removal than just being de-indexed. Where I think in other situations where if it's a like embarrassing image or a story that's a bit more problematic but is on the fence, then maybe de-indexing is a better solution.
Okay. But yeah, as you said, at the same time, when it's disindexed, the content is still there, and often what the victims want is to disappear. So another question, and I don't know if you look into this for your research, but one of the attendees is wondering if you could speak about what's happened for the image of famous or like mildly famous people who passed away. So they, so yeah, especially like for deep fake, and the user is mentioning, for example, like a deep fake with Hitler, or again like other. We might not need to go to.
Oh, real. It's like that's what is that rule 37 of the internet? But did it. But I think it's true. You know, like people are interested in making sexual content, particularly sexual deepfakes, about a wide variety of people. And now that it's possible to create this very realistic looking deepfakes, we need to think about what rights they're going to have after death. And I think if you look in California, they've got, because there's so many celebrities there, they've really tried to enforce more after death rights. And they've been able to protect them from a certain amount of time. And so essentially what happens in that moment is that the estate gets power over that person's identity. And so maybe that's something that we need to consider, like should the estate have control? But even if the estate does have control, are there still dignity factors? There were some cases around people making requests to have sex bots, sex dolls made out of their ex-wives' images, their ex-spouses' images. And because the person had died, you know, and the husband had gotten the estates, they would then have rights to make those recreation of a doll. And is that something that you maybe need to have specifically written into your will so that you have consent, or is that something that you can allow for afterwards? Because we don't want it so limited that you couldn't use deepfakes for something really creative. Like if your partner had said, yes, after I pass away, I want you to still engage with me sexually. Like I want us to be able to create that kind of content even after I've died. Or if they want to make a documentary, a lot of filmmakers have said we have to be careful around these rights to personality and these rights to images, because what if we want to make images of a famous figure after their death? And I think with famous figures, there's a little bit more fair game with them. With sexual content, I think there's something really special about sexual content that's different than just creating, maybe if you made like a silly movie about someone who's passed away, should the estate be able to control that? I think that might fit more in like the documentary or the satire. But I do think that post-mortem considerations are real. You're seeing these robots. People want to live forever. People are freezing their brains. They're doing all sorts of wild things. And with this AI technology, there's interesting ways to extend not necessarily our lives, but our identities.
No, true. And someone just mentioned in the chat, and I was thinking the same way, the same thing. I don't know if you saw that new show on Amazon, Upload, which is exactly about this. So this is the future. So I know it's like 1 p.m., but there is still like a few questions that have been asked like 10 minutes ago. So if it's okay with you, I will ask you those questions to kind of continue the conversation.
Yeah. And if anybody has to go, like if it's 1 o'clock, head off to whatever. But anyone who wants to stay, I'm happy to chat.
Perfect. So another question in the chat is, what about consensual audio fakes that call you impersonating, for example, like politicians, having a detailed conversation with you over the phone to get your vote or donation? What rights do you have as the target of those audio bots engaging you without you acknowledge that they are not the actual person? So like from the other side of the equation.
That's a really interesting question. I have thought about that because I've heard about this AI technology where you can get someone to like book a reservation for you, and the person on the other line doesn't realize, like the restaurant doesn't realize that they're talking to an AI bot. But like, what implications are there when it's someone who specifically is a figure that you're supposed to have a trusting relationship with and who has influence over you and is then influencing you without it being genuine? Is that something that you need to be notified about? That's a great question. Yeah. I don't know. My gut says yes. We should know in those types of situations.
Yeah, and I'm wondering. I think there might have been a FTC ruling in the US. When Google started to promote the new options in Google Voice with the automated calls and stuff. But so thank you so much for that question. We're gonna look into this because this is awesome. So another.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, sorry. Go.
I was about to say, like, and this is really like the main issue that's coming up with a lot of this fake content too. Yeah. It's not letting us know what we can trust anymore. Like, we don't know, like, if someone's calling us, can we trust that it's our mom or our grandma who's asking us to send them $10,000 because they're in an emergency? Like, can we, how do we know that these things are real? And so I think a lot of the technological solutions that have been offered have been things like maybe legislating and saying, if it's a deep fake, you have to say that it's a deep fake, or if it's a fake voice, you have to say it's a deep fake voice, So there might be other ways of using technological solutions to point out which ones are real and which ones are fake.
Yeah. So another comment. So someone going back to the conversation about Amy Cooper, but I guess everybody like was on social media. I've seen those videos, and so that entity is wondering, like, in that case, would you consider it to be more like surveillance rather than like public shaming, or maybe like an act of protection on the part of Bearder?
Well, I think we are seeing that. Like, there's been this real struggle with having video evidence. Like, video evidence is such a useful thing because we can now show these subtle moments of racism and sexism. That one wasn't so subtle, but these experiences that people have. This is a way for us to document and show that these experiences are real, when often racialized people or women or whoever it is that experiences discrimination like this, they tell their truth all the time and they're not believed. So having video evidence of this, I think, is really important, and it's a tool to help us protect ourselves and expose truths. I am concerned about online mobs. You know, in all cases, I think when someone is targeted on the internet, I think there is some concern about what is going to happen with people on both sides. I know with the gentleman on the other side, Mr. Cooper, everyone started digging through his history, trying to find something about him that, you know, maybe the other side could use against him. And unfortunately, he was this like wonderful, you know, birding, comic book writing, amazing human. But I saw some really interesting comments on Twitter saying it doesn't matter if this person's a good person. You know, what happened to them was completely wrong. And so I don't know how the law is going to deal with online mobs, both in appropriate situations where maybe a person did deserve to be online shamed, or in situations where sometimes the wrong person is identified and we all go at them. But I do think that there are certain circumstances where filming discrimination that happens against you is completely appropriate.
And so the last question, which I like, and I could myself comment for hours on that question. So that attendee would love to hear you more on proposed legal reform, and do we need a PIPEDA style solution that tries to establish a Canada-wide baseline? Does this even belong in PIPEDA? And does that baseline look like updating the kind of test that Edition Vice Versa case applied? I would add, like, is PIPEDA even the solution for anything, because there is no enforcement? But this is my own comments. I will give you the floor.
Yeah, that's the thing that I've really been exploring. I'm actually really looking forward to, there's a great anthology that's coming out that's on tech facilitated violence. And people are exploring these issues, like what are the solutions that we want to these types of, and not necessarily just tech facilitated violence, but ability to control our images, you know, and is it something that we need more of an administrative board for it? Is this something we should tack onto PIPEDA? Is this something that we want criminal laws for? You know, do we want to expand our appropriation of personality laws to include dignity? Like, what is it that we want? And that's ultimately the question that I'm asking for my PhD research. So I don't have any answers. If you talk to me in 2 years, I'll probably have something for you.
We will do this again in 2 years now. Anyway, so I think we're gonna stop here for today. Thank you so much, Suzie, to be with us today to open that first series. Thank you for everybody for joining today's conversation. I hope that you enjoyed this talk as much as I did, and thank you so much for all the amazing questions. So the event was recorded and we will upload it on our YouTube channel, as we usually do with other events, by the end of the week. And so that was the first event. We're gonna continue over the summer, and I invite you to join us next week for a talk for a conversation with Cynthia Ko on digital platform harms. So see you next week. Please go to our website, RSVP, and we will send you the links for the next meeting. And I will right now post the link in the chat if you haven't seen it. Okay, so again, Suzie, thank you so much for joining us, and have a lovely day. Bye bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.